And this will, and then I'm going to share my screen. So, okay, which one? I want to share desktop 2. Okay. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen, desktop 2. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna move it. I don't know, where is that? Oh, okay. Hold on, let me stop that. Let me restart it here. I'm gonna share this screen and put it here. Yeah, okay. Okay, so this way I can still see if anyone raises their hands or anything like that. So okay, sorry, just trying to get set up here. Okay, so hopefully you can see the notes here. And like I said, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of show you the review sheet. And really, if I don't see your hand, I'm not sure about how my screen is working right now. I think I can see if anyone raises their hand or anything. Let's see, let me find. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that. And yeah, I don't know. I've lost the view of my controls at all for Zoom, but okay. So if I don't recognize you, you can butt in, just kind of raise your voice and I'll hear it because everyone's muted. So if you unmute yourself and just ask a question, you can do that. Okay. So all right. So first things first. So this goes back. I wanted to go back. Just basically, why am I giving you all the way the review sheet all the way back to Fordism? Well, because as you'll see, most of the final topics deal with the second half of the course, and so there are some questions you can go back and visit: nationalism, race, and gender, and sexuality, all those things. And I hope that you do if you want to go back and look at some of those questions. Um, but for the most part, I wanted you to kind of direct your final papers to some of these other more complex ways that social scientists are dealing with identity right now. So I started with Fordism to post-Fordism, and so as the background for that, we did this. This is before the shutdown either, so this is going way back to I think February. World systems theory, capitalist world system. And I'm not going to revisit this now, but you'll see this in the notes, and so you can see what the transition consisted of from the early or 20th century to after the 1960s, and so that's where all the globalization literature starts. This is when post-structuralism is becoming more mainstream, or at least becoming mainstream. This is like the decline of nationalism, and so just this much more international, this much more global way of interpreting social forms starts here. And this is also so this will hopefully will be useful as you're trying to pick apart things like Bellsdorf and Second Life, or Orientalism with Kondo, or with Ansal Dua's work about border identities. And so again, this is the kind of economy where border identities are going to become more prevalent, right? And that these other ideas of experiencing the world in terms of identity are going to start to become more common and be recognized in the literature. So then, even back then, I already mentioned postmodernity back then. I didn't have time because of the shutdown. If I had been there in person, I probably would have given you that postmodernity lecture in this context, but we lost a couple of weeks. So you can look at this here and compare it to what I did last class, postmodernity, about just these. This is the the economic base, to use the Marxist terms, this is the economic base of postmodernity. So if the economic base changes, then the ideas and the way of experiencing the world is going to change with that. And so the material changes are here. These are some of the main ones that some of the economists who started to theorize globalization started to look at. And then you have cultural changes that are kind of more important to us in terms of identity. These are the cultural changes that accompany it. So you've got the decline of the nation state, travel and communication, time, space compression, and in general, time and space are just going to become frazzled because we live in multiple time zones. History is kind of weird now because there's so many images and so many sources of information beyond the nation state and its education system. Time, the way we account for time and the way we see ourselves as moving through time as part of a community or external to a community or as individuals, they've all been changed. Space has been obliterated through, you saw in No Logo, advertising is kind of commodified public space. And so these ways that we used to fit ourselves into these spatial communities is disrupted, right? So it hasn't gone away. You can look at Stuart Hall also, right? So it hasn't gone away, but it's just more complicated now. It has more to compete with. And so people are remixing things more than they ever have. So cultural styles and flavors, in the anthropological term from Clifford Geertz, if you are familiar with him, styles, flavors, influence, all combined in urban centers more than ever before. So people don't feel like they were born into a particular culture, right? So cultural hybridity is this act of remixing. Cultural homogenization goes along with it. So you can see this is in a Pottery too, like a homogenization. Every main street in major cities around the world pretty much look the same because they've been taken over by the same corporations, the same consumer things. Although, you could, thinking about the pandemic, maybe is this going to stay the same? Is this going to change? That could be something to write about. I don't have a question about that, but you can, by Wednesday, I may have a question that relates to the pandemic because are we going to be the same kinds of consumers that we used to be is something that people are kind of worried about. And so the end results, you got things that cross borders, like Anzaldúa, rootlessness and alienation, people who haven't found an answer. Anzaldúa seems to have found her answer in pre-Columbian gods and goddesses from and Mesoamerica and Mexico. She's found her answer, but a lot of people don't find their answer. They just kind of float around. They don't have anything to attach to. And so as consumers, and you saw this with No Logo, right? This is what makes us want to join these brand tribes, right? This is what makes people want to sign up for and purchase identities because they're just not, they're not ingrained in us from an early age like they used to be because we're exposed to so many stuff, so many things. I have a 9 and 11-year-old, right? And they're just now getting used to social media and the internet. And it's just, you can just see the influence as a parent slipping away because everything is online. They can be exposed to anything. They're hearing about all kinds of stuff. So, and so it just gives you something to select from. Sometimes, we still have power dynamics with things, but some people have more influence over style and things than other people, which is why last class I was talking about influencer culture and Instagram, things like that. So, you've got this representation in politics representation is politics. Representations are politics now. It's, so if you can define reality for people, then you have a much more deep impact on the choices that people can make in terms of politics, in terms of identity, in terms of consumption. And again, this is something that the postmodernists would have agreed with, that, it's the shallowing out, the surface, the way that politics have just become based on very shallow and superficial ideas and images and things. So we don't have these deep discussions about the impact of policy. It's just more about who can inspire the most people without really saying anything. And that's, it's obviously something that can apply to Trump, but, in some ways, in a much smaller degree, this goes all the way back to the Reagan years in the 80s. Every administration is really, there's a lot of emptiness in all of them. But And so this was supposed to lead to a kind of schizophrenia, an emptiness, a void in terms of identity. So this is what specifically ties it to identity. There's a lot of uncertainty with it. It's everything is shifting. It changes over time. And some people would say that the categories, I mean, some of the categories like sexuality, yeah, you can look at that and see how flexible things are and how it's changing over time, and that people have more option. It's much more fluid now. Um, I can give you an example. My 11-year-old daughter was having a chat room conversation with one of her friends, and my my yeah, I just had this. It's fresh on my mind because we were just talking about this, and she was trying to console a female friend of hers. They're sixth graders, right? And um, she was telling my wife and I about the conversation, and she said, "Oh, I was just kind of cool." She was really upset because she misses her friend, and her friend is this girl, and and she told me, she said she hasn't told her parents, but she's bi and all this stuff. And my wife, who was from mainland China, was just mortified by all of this, like, and I was telling my daughter, and we were talking later. I was like, "Yeah, your mom's probably. I've heard of this stuff, but even when I was a kid, the term bi wouldn't have meant anything to me, right?" And so, and I was telling, I was kind of giving her sexuality theory as we were talking about it. I was saying, like, "Yeah, your mom's kind of freaked out by this because when we were young, even when I was young, growing up in the U.S., we didn't have that terminology, and kids have all kinds of emotions and urges, and if you have kids, you've seen it, especially if they've reached puberty. They have all kinds of, you saw from the middle sexes video that people have all kinds of desires and emotions, and they're very intense, and kids are trying to make sense of it. And if you have the vocabulary, then it will be expressed as bisexuality or queerness or homosexuality, however you want to, whatever terms they're exposed to. And so I was just telling my daughter, it's like, yeah, it's like, people don't worry about it too much. It's like, what, people, everyone has these emotions. That's not new. And they have these urges and desires. But what changes over time is the language we use to understand it. And that's something that's from the postmodernist movement. It's like, yeah, a lot of the stuff is filtered through language. Without the terminology, the feelings may be there, but you don't have a way to express it. And so you just have them, you deny it or you accept it or whatever. But I like the fact that these kids have a way to work through their feelings, and they have a different thing. Does that mean that her sixth grade friend is bi or something? Who knows? We don't know yet. That's the thing. So I was telling her, because it was kind of becoming a big thing. It's like, yeah, it's, people have feelings and they're trying to make sense of them. Um, so that's one of the effects of these ways that culture changes over time. So sexuality is pretty obvious. Race, you could say the same thing, is becoming much more ambiguous. You've got people crossing racial boundaries, not because the government is telling them they're a different race, but because they are identifying with different race, with different races. So, as a kid, again, my kids are biracial or mixed or however you want to put it. I don't like either one of those terms, but we don't really have the language for it. They're Asian and Black. So sometimes they're Asian, sometimes they're Black. To most people outside of our family, they're gonna be coded as Black. So I'm trying to make sure that they're prepared, because to me and most people, they look much more Black than Asian. So although you can kind of see the influences, but it's much more confusing to people. But even on an individual level, there's just so many things to choose from or to have imposed on you that it's a much more fluid world. So that was the point of all of that about um, late modernity, post modernity, whatever you want to call that age. Um, okay, so I'm not going to go through I'm giving you notes here. The next section is on a pottery. And how to study culture in this context. And so you've got global corporations competing. That's like no logo, filling the void with commodities. But then we as anthropology um, need to look at how interconnected our world is in terms of finance-scapes, media-scapes, ideoscapes, technoscapes, and ethnoscapes. And so this is not an exhaustive list. This essay of Apotheorized was famous because he came up with a list of ways that we need to look at how people are connected. But the main point here is to get beyond this idea that culture is contained by national boundaries. I mean, we're seeing with the pandemic, as here's another aspect of the pandemic, people are shocked at how fast this virus has traveled around the world, but well, it travels because people travel. We always have. It's accelerated since the 1970s, but the virus travels because people are everywhere. So there's nothing fundamentally new about that. It's just that this one tends to make more people sick and make them sicker, so but viruses have all, they don't recognize national borders because in our behavior we don't recognize them really. So um some people can travel more than others, but people, and so we need to look at these um connections. And even, you could add a bioscape to it, or a medical scape, or something like that. Um epidemic scape or something, and then look at the way that we're so interconnected that it's difficult to understand identities in terms of place. And so he's saying that you can follow the people, follow the symbol, follow the money, follow the image, or stay in one place and see what comes through. So Hanners was, it's a metaphor I used to refer to in lecture I did this year, but about, if you want to understand the life of the people that live in the house, you don't just hang around the house and watch them, although that would help. You need to look at their trash, look at their mail, um, monitor their communications. Of course, we wouldn't do that, but you're seeing, to really understand this family, you can't just focus on the space of the house, because there are all these things that come through. So even if you do field work in one place, you need to look at how that place is connected to other places. That's basically what the house metaphor is about. Okay, so then I move on to postmodernism. I'm not gonna go so in depth in all these. I just wanted to remind you of how these things fit together. This is what I did last class. Um, so what was postmodernism as a movement, as a result, an aftermath, a development, a denial, a rejection? Well, it's kind of all of these things. So and it did exist at the same time as modernism. Um, so I talked about art last class. I talked about urban planning. These are on the slides. I didn't post the slides, but they're all in the video. So you can go back and look at the slides about post-modernity again, and then I just repeat some of the things that I said about post-structure, post-Fordism. So all of this I talked about in the lecture, in the 1-hour lecture that's posted to YouTube now. So you can go back and look at it. Fundamentalism, don't forget that fundamentalism is a really big part of this, always has been. So people in news media now are just shocked at fundamentalism, political fundamentalism, like make America great again, right? That's always been there with globalization, because not everyone reacts the same way, right, to constant change and fluidity. Some people want to fix identities, but the thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about fundamentalism is that they're always looking at an image. It's rarely based on accurate history, right? It's based on, so people who want the US to return to some ideal state that they imagined existed again. So Potterite, the imagination is political, right? They're imagining some kind of perfect America, and it's always in terms of just, they're basically basing it on movies, especially now. If anyone who's talking about 1950s now wasn't old enough or wasn't alive yet to remember it, so they're basing it on movies, they're basing it on television, they're basing it on media imagery that's also has a skewed relationship to reality. So they're not even, it's like the Matrix, right? They're looking back at something that didn't really exist in the first place, right? So I think I mentioned this in class before we went remote, but it's I Love Lucy, and I gave you an example. I Love Lucy was a propaganda program. It was part of a propaganda. It's good entertainment, but it was also part of a propaganda program to convince women not to. Let's see, I got something in the chat. Studio propaganda rather than live shows. Live shows. When was the first live news? Okay, so Kevin's asking. Okay, so yeah, so. Studio propaganda, yeah, but it's also, it was coordinated with, I can send you references to this, but it was coordinated with the government. What wanted to get met, they wanted women to go home from factories, right? Because they were, Rosie the Riveter, this wasn't a universal thing, but it was, these guys that came home from the front lines of World War II needed jobs, and some women were not, they weren't into going back home and just raising kids and cooking. They kind of like the freedom, they like controlling the paycheck, having more power in the family, and just enjoyed the work, or it was a new deal for them. So I Love Lucy, and I mentioned in the lecture that I Love Lucy's whole thing was, you know, the humor in that film is based on her trying to do something outside the home and failing, right? And so it just kind of reinforces this idea that women belong in the home, and it was very slick. Um, and when fundamentalists look back to the 1950s and 60s, that's what they're thinking about. They're thinking about stuff like that. Well, that's just one example of how, well, that was not a reflection of reality. That was someone trying to create a reality. That was someone trying to revive something that they thought existed before, and may have in some ways. So um, I grew up watching Mayberry RFD, and I grew up in North Carolina where the show was out. And then later the Andy Griffith show. You know, same show pretty much. It didn't really reflect where I grew up in North Carolina. It kind of did, but people identify with this stuff. They think that's, for them, that constitutes history, and it's a misreading of the relationship between media imagery and reality, right? So even if someone 50 years from now saying like, yeah, the 2020s were like perfect, and let's go back to the 2020s. Well, what do you have to look at? Reality shows, um, you know, like shows that are set now that are kind of a reflection, like NCIS, or like I don't know that just name any TV shows, Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, or I guess that's earlier. Um, you know, I watched Ozark recently, and it's like, yeah, is that a reflection of 2019, 2018 America? Yeah, kind of. But 50 years from now, people may not understand that that's super exaggerated. Not everyone sells drugs. Like, not everyone does drugs. But if you grow up with that imagery and you look back at it and that was a happier time in your personal life, you might want to recreate that, right? So that's kind of how fundamentalism works. So I'm going to move on from there. Um, Okay, so again, that was what, and so after the postmodernism, so originally postmodernism would have been in that section of the class. So I had to kind of go back to it last class. So that would be before Foucault, right? So you got bits and pieces of postmodernity before post-structuralism, but then now you got Foucault and his work on power. Um, okay, so. Um, I'm not going to re-give the lecture on Foucault. I'm going to show you something from Foucault in the comic book that I posted. I do have that pulled up. I'm going to show you that shortly. Just basically the idea that governments, for Foucault, governments and later theorists would add corporations do this too, and that's kind of what Klein was doing with No Logo. They have these regimes of what he called governmentality, of discipline and surveillance and categorization. And what they do is they kind of make you what they need you to be so that you don't have to be policed. And so that's and so for Foucault, power is repressive. It's productive. It's not repressive. It makes things. Power makes it. If you look at the film, for example, if you look at the film Performing the Border, normally in class discussion, I'll just ask, like, what does power make? Well, it makes a lot of things in that film. It makes electronic components, it makes computers, it makes cell phones, but it also makes women vulnerable by turning them into replaceable, interchangeable pieces of corporate machinery that exist outside of a national framework of policing and labor laws and things like that. So at the same time it's cranking out these products, it's also creating these women to be what Foucault called docile bodies for labor. So they don't have, you know, there are ways of resisting. Resistance is always part of it, but they have fewer and fewer choices in terms of resistance, and no one really seems to care. And so that film, Performing the Border, that film looks at how those women are being exploited in a very systematic fashion. And it's a really good, and the serial killer that they talk about that's killing these women on the outskirts of these factories, um, on the outskirts of these factories, you know, seems to be acting on these ideas that these women are interchangeable. And he's remixing, you know, the killer or killers are remixing the bodies, they're misplacing, you know, they're changing the clothes. They'll kill two women, then reverse their clothes, and just weird things. And so the filmmaker is kind of positing that, you know, maybe, you know, they're seeing this is kind of an illustration of what's happening to them, and the killer is kind of acting out on it. Okay, so, and it's producing other things. So power in that film, it's producing the women's bodies in a certain way. It's producing the products that they make. It's producing new dynamics in the families of those women, right? So they're controlling the paychecks. That gives them more power in the family, but it also increases the instances of spousal abuse or domestic violence, because it's just creating these new tensions. And so, again, corporations, these transnational corporations and non-governmental organizations that control these zones where these women work are using power as a technique to get their products made cheaply. And so again, that's not America, it's not Mexico, although America and Mexico are involved in making the agreements. It's basically these non-democratic multinational organizations that are making all of this stuff happen. And so again, from Foucault, power is productive, it's not just repressive. It can be repressive, but for the most part, what post-structuralism gave us is the idea that power is productive. And Foucault's work kind of shows you the process of how that happens. In terms of identity, we talk about subject making more than we talk about enculturation or developing your identity. So Foucauldian analysis looks at subjectivities. And so this is basically how sexualities, races, and genders and national identities are kind of sutured together. It never totally works, they fall apart, but these regimes of governmentality need to tie these things together. And so one of the ways it does is all the surveillance and disciplining the body to do something called biopower. It's an individualizing encounter. So it turns you into an individual, and that's where the panopticon comes in. As it individualizes you, you police yourself, you see fewer options, you behave in ways that in very prefigured ways. And so, and then it gets into resistance, things like that. Okay. We did cover Orientalism this semester. This was from a previous year. This part of the review sheet, I kind of remixed some stuff here. So we did cover Orientalism. I kind of missed this part, but yeah, we did cover it. Ties it to world. I tie it to world theory and kind of give you the main ideas of it. I won't go back into that because that was fairly recent. So you can go back and watch that lecture if you're curious about that, and Madama Butterfly, and as a rewriting of those narratives. And then I also give you my notes. So here are a lot of quotes from Ansal Dua. I would suggest just reading through this section. I give you chapter 1. I also give you chapter 2, which I didn't assign, but it does help you understand what she's up to. There's some fairly long quotes here. Look at my notes about the shadow beast. She wants to revive this monster inside of her that everyone outside, because of nationalism in America and nationalism in Mexico and the imperialism of the Aztecs, like all the way back, it's just been repressing, subverting again. So that's, it sound like post-structuralism, these repressed narratives. So she's trying to awaken it and confront it. So she says, not many jump at the chance to confront the shadow beast in the mirror without flinching at her lidless serpent eyes, her cold, clammy, moist hand dragging us underground, fangs barred and hissing. How does one put feathers on this particular serpent? But a few have been lucky. On the face of the shadow beast, we've seen not lust, but tenderness. On its face, we've uncovered the lie. And what she's talking about here kind of sums up her whole project, is that as a woman of color, as a queer woman of color, there's so many aspects of her lives that have just been demonized by religion, by nationalism, by politics, by brute force, by linguistic policies, that she's had to fight through it. And in her case, she says she uses queer theory and feminism to fight through that and see the tenderness on this beast that everyone talks about. And so it's not a monster, like, it's who I am. It's part of me. I was born with it. And so in some ways, Anzaldúa goes against the grain of some of the postmodernists, but in other ways, it's a very postmodern book. So, and how does it go against the grain of postmodernity? Well, it's going beneath the surface and saying that these things, she was born with these aspects of her identities. It's natural for her. It is postmodernist in that, she's playing with history in a lot of ways. She's choosing to be things like her queerness. She says she chose it. It was a choice for her because it was the ultimate FU to patriarchy, right? To reclaim one's sexuality. There's a quote where she says, reclaiming one's sexuality is the most resistant thing a woman can do, especially a woman of color, right? So, um, okay, and that's, against the pressures of intimate terrorism. So again, so go through it. I even give you chapter notes from chapter 3, quotes. I used to assign a lot more of this book. So you can look at that, trying to piece together her argument. Um, uh, and I will say one more thing about it. I can get chapter 4, the Coatlic U state. So um, look at what she says about La Facultad. Like, you don't need that. I gave you enough of quotes here to really see that. She says that La Facultad is the capacity to see in surface phenomena the meanings of deeper realities, to see deep structure below the surface. It's a sensing, a quick perception arrived at without conscious reasoning. It's an awareness mediated by that part of the psyche that does not speak, that communicates in images and symbols, behind the feelings which reside, hide. The one possessing the sensitivity is excruciatingly alive. And so to the world. So she says that the more marginal you are in terms of race, gender, sexuality, nationality, social class, like the more you have this extra perception of oppression. And it's basically a way of saying, they have a better bullshit sensor, right? They can kind of see inequality and they see oppression. And, I think most people would agree with that. I don't know if they put it in such spiritual terms, but, the more oppressed you are, the more of she's arguing that the more oppressed you are, the more of you have more of a sense for, the better you are at sensing out oppression and inequality and injustice, and that you feel it. It may be below the level of words. You may not be able to talk about it articulately. You might not be able to express it. But she says it's that part of the psyche that communicates in images and symbols, and you just recognize it instantly. You don't just recognize it, you feel it. And so again, think about Foucault, the body. Oppression happens through these regimes of governmentality. The place where it takes hold is at the body, and that's also where resistance starts. And so if you can take this idea, and this is why anthropologists love her book so much, this book so much, is that it's kind of a more poetic rendering of post-structuralism. It's like, it's on my body that these things are. It's in my body. She's saying she's born with them. So it's a deep thing. I highly recommend you buy the book, just read it. I get a lot of artwork for final projects based on Anzaldua's work because it seems to really speak to people and not just Latinx women. It speaks to a lot of people. It actually speaks to me in some ways. And so even though her message is very specific, there are a lot of things that are really universal about what she does here with her work. So I think it's very powerful. Okay. So next class we'll go, so I end there. I don't have any notes. You can go back and look. My contribution to the review for Second Life and Tom Belsdorf's work is gonna have to be their lecture. You can go back and watch the lecture and see the slides to get my notes on Belsdorf. And that's been posted to Beachboard. It's on YouTube. And so on Wednesday, what we'll do, we will go through these. You have a copy of these questions. So I would suggest go through the questions before Wednesday. Decide if you want to answer one of those questions, and I'll just open up the floor. I'm not going to lecture. I'm just going to let you ask questions about the questions, and then I'll help you even walk through answering some of these questions. And so there are questions about Anzaldúa. They're just kind of tied to the lecture notes there. But then I have final paper topics and suggestions. So you can go through that. I named some films that you might not have heard of. That's fine if you can think of something else. Or you can look up the films I mentioned, like Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai, or Memento, or something like that. And so go through those and think about your final projects. You can also, as I said, you can do a film, you can do something that you can present digitally over Zoom. You can still do that. So just let me know, just kind of give me a heads up about what you're thinking about. Don't freak out too much about the final. Yes, it's an 8 to 10 page paper. I'm still going to require you to do it, but grade wise, I just want you to go for it. If you're thinking about writing a poem and you want to tell the class about it, on the day of the final exam. And so we'll schedule that. I think it's 12:15 to 2:15. on next Wednesday. So we'll meet, for those who want to do presentations, we'll just meet via Zoom, and other people are invited to during the final time. Just let me know what you're thinking by email, and I can answer your email. But generally, I, like most professors, are going to grade really easy for final. Like, just, it's kind of a question of, did you do it or you didn't do it? Did you do it or did you not do it? And, I'll give you a few comments, but I'm not gonna really I'm not gonna grade hard on the final. So look at the questions, they're on Beachboard, they're there. So I'm gonna spend, let me know if you have any questions and we'll discuss them. Oops. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna drag this in. So I'm not gonna go
Professor?
through this. Yes, that's a question. Okay.
Yeah. For the presentation, how long does that have to be if we want to do presentation instead?
About 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's usually 8 to 12 minutes, so about 10 minutes. If you do an art piece, it can be shorter because you put the work into the art. If you do a PowerPoint, I'm looking at 10 minutes. If you do a film, keep it below 10 minutes or less for the film. Or, so if you create something like an art piece, a sculpture or something, and you want to show it to us, I mean, we have cameras, we can do it here. If you do an art piece, you just have to show it to us, maybe turn in a description to me, and then just tell us about it. That can be shorter, like 3 to 5 minutes or something like that, just telling us about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So, and that I'll send out an email just explaining all this, but we'll do that during we have a 2-hour period for exams. So we can do it during that time. And that would be next Monday. Sorry. It's the exams are next Monday. Sorry. I saw something pop up in the chat. I can't find the box for it. So, hold on.
I can just say it out loud if you want.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, I can't find the chat.
For the
My controls.
presentation, can it be on a topic we did for like a past essay, but just still expand on it?
Yes, we can expand on a previous essay, include more information. You can do something like that. Hold on, I'm finding. Where did it go? Okay, hold on, let me find that. Yeah, you can expand on. You can just expand on. Where'd it go? Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, computer does weird things. Oh, okay, so I can't find anything. All right, I don't think I close it. I thought I just minimize it. No, it's not there. There it is. Okay, so yeah, you can expand on a previous topic. That's fine. Yeah, just include more data on it, a different movie, or tie it to something that we hadn't done at that point when you first wrote it. So yeah, that's a good way to go with the questions. Just make sure it's a substantial expansion on it. So if that answers your question. Okay. All right. So all right, I'm just gonna walk you through this because there are a couple of things, since I've got you here. There are a couple of things about this. There are a couple of things about this that you probably don't need to look at. If you have more time, for the final, you don't need to master this material, but I think it's really helpful if you're just really trying to, not for class performance, but if you just really want to understand what the hell all this stuff is about, this is a really good intro. So right now, and the book's from 2004, introducing postmodernism, and it just kind of walks you through. It has a lot of other stuff about the postmodernist movement, but this excerpt I'm giving you is just about helping you understand things like Foucault and Foucault and signification and representation and stuff like that. So if you've had linguistic anthropology as a class before, and almost all anthropology majors have had it at this point. So if you have had it, that would help. That'll help you understand it a little bit. So, so it starts out, I'll show you the part you can probably skip. So talking about structuralism, because again, Foucault is a post-structuralist. And so this book is trying to unpack all of that. And so it starts by talking about structuralism. Well, what does that mean? Well, Ferdinand de Saussure gave us a new way. Here's Saussure, right? Oops. Saussure is down here. Ferdinand de Saussure, I mentioned him in class. I remember talking about this in lecture before the shutdown. Gave us a new way of studying language in the 1920s. Again, it was after he died, his students took his lectures and wrote a book, and it just turned this total wildfire, like, wow, new way of doing social science, basically. And this part talks about how to understand the language, you have to get beyond origins and practice, right? So let's look at, and so what he was saying is, let's look at the deep structural language and what they all have in common, because it can help us understand human behavior more. So, and the key part here, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but the key part here is that words and expressions and sentences inside of a language only make sense in terms of all of that system. And so when you take a word outside of its system, its language, then it's arbitrary, its meaning is arbitrary. And that was a breakthrough. It sounds common sense to us now, but at the time that was a huge breakthrough, because people used to think that words are related to the objects they refer to, or the history of it. People used to use history and origins and speech acts to understand language. But he's saying, like, no, there are things that languages have in common. And what they have in common is that meanings are arbitrary, and meanings come from the system. They don't come from the word. They come from that word's relationships to other words inside of a system. And even, it goes even further than that. You don't have to look at even words, because what Saussure, goes to the point where he talks about phonemes and monemes, right? So these sounds, a word itself, even when it's compared to other words, its meaning comes from its relation. The meaning of that one word comes from the sounds within that word and how they relate to each other. And then the meaning, and then that gives it distinction, as opposed to other words like cat and bat are pretty close, but the k and the b is what signifies the difference between the words, right? And so so then you go to the level of the word, and it only makes sense in terms of its difference from other words. So blue has nothing to do with the wavelength of that color. Our understanding of it comes from the relationship between the word blue and the word red, and then they also refer to something in the real world. And so this is what makes up a sign. And so that's what he's talking about here. So why is that important? Well, think about it in terms of identity, right? If I say I am an African American male, that means absolutely nothing to someone in sub-Saharan Africa who did not grow up in America and is not familiar with our racial categories, right? They may have an opinion about the way I appear and they may know where I'm from, but that term, African American, means absolutely nothing to them. I mean, maybe through media they may have an understanding, but let's assume they're not watching TV or something like that. Like it's taken outside of its context. And I think I mentioned this in class once, where African American anthropologists who go to Africa are shocked to learn that they're not Black there. Like that the other people outside of our racial systems don't have the same understanding of your identity. So this is the impact of Saussure and this new kind of linguistics in the 20th century, between that and social sciences, but also specifically with identity. So ethnicity, I talked about how Barth is famous for studying ethnicity, and he talked about how it's not the content of an ethnic group that defines who they are. I mean, even though people talk about it that way, it's the difference between, it's the way you understand difference between one group and the other, or the other, that gives them meaning. So so if you're looking for a definition for ethnicity, Barth kind of told us that, well, how do you define an ethnic group? Well, does a person say it's the belief that you belong to this group, because food changes over time, language changes over time, skin tone and hair texture, it changes over time. What remains is the idea that I belong to this group called African Americans, for example. And so 100 years from now, African Americans may look different. Caucasians, European Americans in the US will probably look different 100 years from now, but that social category, that ethnicity will still exist, even if the people look different, because the differences kind of just change with culture, right? So, so that's the relationship between the arbitrariness of language the arbitrariness of ethnic categories, the arbitrariness of sexuality categories. There, we see them changing in real time right now, right? Um, the category queer didn't exist when I was a kid. The insult did, because people used to throw it around all the time when I was a kid. We used to play a football game called Smear the Queer when I was a kid in North Carolina, and it bothered me back then. I didn't know why. Um, definitely bothers me now. You know, I don't identify as a queer person, but that term's been around for a long time. But it was kind of reclaimed by some people, and it's turned into something different. Now it's an identity category. It may or may not be related to someone's sexuality, right? It could just mean they're an ally with other queer people. So these the content of categories changes over time. What gives them meaning is their relationship to other categories within a system. So if that's, you know, that may sound a little unclear, but that's clearer than what's here in the text, but that's basically the point of that. And so this is the part, you can, if you've had linguistic training, if you had intro to linguistics or linguistic anthropology, this will make sense to you. Otherwise it may not. This is really important. I use this in my new media ethnography class to talk about the difference between syntagmatic combination and paradigmatic substitution. This I relate to narrative storytelling, and this I relate to interactive storytelling, because things are interchangeable. This part you can skip. If you know linguistic anthropology, it's interesting. This part you can also skip, because they're talking about the difference between metaphor and metonymic. Okay, skip that. Skip this part. So then it gets to structural anthropology. Levi-Strauss, you should have heard of as an anthropology major. But it's a really good explanation of why structural anthropology became so popular. And I mentioned this in lecture once, that it's the same folks who designed binary computers. And so computers work. And so basically Levi-Strauss's model of human culture and how it changes and how people use it is the same as binary programming for computers, because it's the same community of people that came up with the ideas. And so his idea was that culture could be decoded like computer programming. It was really popular. He was the most famous anthropologist in the world for about 20 years. But in the end, it was a dead end. And they talk about that here. So, you know, you can go through an explanation. It's not the Greek explanation of Levi-Strauss. It's succinct, but I don't think it totally gets it. And then they give you these reasons for what was wrong with it. It basically turned people into robots. And we know people aren't robots, and cultures are more than just like computer programs. So, and it totally, it's completely non-historical. You don't even need people in it, much less history. So, so that's why it died out. And so why is he going through structural anthropology? Well, because that's a good intro to post-structuralism. And so I would recommend looking at that. And so this is an explanation for how social sciences have kind of embraced linguistics. And some people say an overemphasis on linguistics in the 20th century, but this Saussurian idea that languages are systems and meaning is arbitrary, and it doesn't, you know, languages don't mean anything, but things within languages mean things, right? So again, it sounds weird, it's like, yeah, it's kind of simple, but it's kind of like that joke on Twitter this week. There's a joke circulating on Twitter right now. An academic just posted something very brief that just said, wow, Foucault just said prisons are like prisons. And everybody was like, wow, which it's a funny joke because it's actually true. It's an oversimplification, but yeah, you could kind of say that. Foucault just said prisons are like prisons. And why was everybody so blown over by that? So, okay. So anyway, it's like that. Okay, so I would say look at that, the death of the author, some of these things. It gets into post-structuralism from how it kind of turned into deconstructionism, which is what we kind of, you've seen examples of this stuff. The arguments that you saw about race and sexuality, that's an act of deconstruction. It's kind of looking at where did we get these terms like heterosexuality and homosexuality? You know, what's the historical genealogy of these things? And so deconstructionism was about peeling back the onion to show that these things are arbitrary, right? So there's that word again. These things are arbitrary, they're historical, they're subject to power, they change over time. Foucault's ideas about epistemes is about that. It just changes. Things change, different narratives and understandings rise through the top, others get pushed down. They're still there, but they're under the surface, and sometimes they get pushed to the top and the other one comes down. So we see it with sexuality, we can see it with race, and it all happens through human action, right? So And so deconstructionism, you go through Derrida. Derrida was really popular in the 90s, but we don't really talk about him that much anymore because his work was kind of a dead end in some ways. I mean, at some point you got to actually try to make stuff, not just criticize everything. So, and he's famous for making a statement about the Gulf War in the early 90s didn't really happen. It was just a TV event, which I think, yeah, it really happened, but he's right to point out the role of media in a lot of this stuff. So, okay, and so I will real point to one last thing about Derrida. This conversation here is really important. So this is the critique of postmodernism in general from a lot of people. It's like, oh, it's just those people don't believe in any kind of truth and they're against reason. And Derrida is saying that I'm not against reason. I'm just saying that reason is so right here he's saying that you reject reason. And his response is no, only its dogmatic representation of itself as timeless certainty. So I'm not saying that he's not saying that logic and reason don't exist, that there isn't an ultimate truth. But what he's criticizing is how when humans get the power to say that they have absolute truth because of science, they tend to do bad things and it becomes dogmatic, right? Any self-respecting scientist will tell you that truth changes over time. Like things that are known become unknown because of research in the scientific method. They would never say that something's true for all time, but politicians on the other hand, and some academics, yeah, they'll discover something and say it's timeless. And then when politicians get their hands on theories like eugenics or whatever, we tend to do awful things with them. And that's why in the previous pages, you see the reference to Auschwitz and the Holocaust. That's what happens, deconstructionists would say that this is what happens when people go overboard with certainty, right? So when humans are absolutely 100% certain, they become dogmatic, and they will tend to believe that the ends justify the means, that this is very modernist, right? Some people would say even that the concentration camps in World War II Germany are the logical end of modernism, right? Because when you think that you have this certain idea that's true and timeless and outside of human intent and politics, you will do anything to achieve it. And if you truly believe these things, this is the logical conclusion. If you truly believe that there are perfect humans or normal people and you want to perfect humanity, that was its logical conclusion. I think Derrida is the one who said that poetry after Auschwitz is an abomination or is barbaric or something like that. Like, how can we do poetry after humans have systematically and industrially killed millions of people, right? So he's saying you reject reason. No, it's only dogmatic representation of itself as timeless certainty. Another critique, you say nothing is real because everything is only a cultural, linguistic, or historical construct. So right, race, sexuality, gender, social constructions. How can you say they're not real? Nothing is any less real for being cultural, linguistic, or historical, especially if there is no universal, timeless reality to which it can be compared, right? So he's saying that something's culturally constructed isn't saying it's not real. You saw that in the race films, right? Race is a social construction, but it's still real, right? That doesn't mean it's not real. That just means it's arbitrary, right? So there's that word again, arbitrary, right? So you say that there are an infinite number of meanings. Like, no, I'm not saying it's infinite. You can get to the bottom of some things in terms of social sciences. You say, no, only that there's never just one meaning behind anything. So no one has absolute power to control the meaning of anything, stuff like that. So again, you have to look at Foucault and power knowledge. Like all knowledge is connected to power, so that the increase of one is the increase of the other, right? So increase of power is the increase of knowledge. Increase of knowledge is an increase in power. They're interconnected, and most knowledge produced that becomes officially validated institutionally as truth through science or something like that. Like it's always attached to power. Last thing, you say everything is of equal value. It's like, no, only that the question must remain open. That's a little fuzzier. It's like basically saying that he's not saying that all behaviors are equally valued. It's like, no, it's just that we can't be closed to the idea that some things that we think may not have value do have value. And you see that things like sex workers' rights. the sex worker movement, you know, would have been unthinkable like 40 years ago, 30 years ago. Like, I'm thinking over my lifespan, it would have been unthinkable for people to say that sex workers deserve rights, because the churches, some intellectuals had demonized prostitution to the extent where it was just seen as objectively wrong, or any kind of sex work, porn, prostitution, arrangements that people make between each other that involve sex, anything that can be seen as sex work, um, was just demonized as wrong. It's a vice, it's evil, it's sinful, it's immoral. It's like, well, we leave the question open, and you can see that culture has changed. There's a whole movement. A lot of academics and some presidential candidates are like, oh, these people are workers and they deserve rights, and this shouldn't even be illegal anyway. So, so the question must always remain open. So that's a very thing. So, so then the last is just 2 more pages, 3 more pages. The last page is a really good explanation of Foucault. And so this is probably the most useful thing about it. So the 2 most helpful aspects of this excerpt I gave you is the part about de Saussure and language, and then the last part about Foucault and power knowledge. So I'm not going to go through this. I'll let you read it because this lecture is getting longer and longer. He talks about Picasso here and what his paintings did. Eugenics, about excluding the other. So this is all about otherization, power, epistemes, excluded unfit subhumans, right? Prostitutes reveal asymmetrical facial anomalies in masculine body traits. This was a belief back in the 1800s. And so it was kind of like their destiny was encoded in them. So you look at someone, oh, she's a prostitute. Well, let's look at her face. Well, you know, you're discounting medical issues and poverty and socially transmitted diseases in some cases, not all cases, but, you know, that can account for some of the things that may have measured. And they probably had skewed data anyway, because they already knew what they were going to find out, what they wanted to find out. So this idea that humans can be perfected was based on testing people, right? So okay, so, and this is the part where you're talking about how theory, how Foucault would say that theory is practice. It is local and regional, not totalizing. It's not to awaken consciousness that we struggle, but to sap power. So again, this is the difference between Foucault and Marx. I'm not trying to give you revolutionary consciousness. I'm trying to sap power through writing theory. And so this is where you see the term praxis a lot. This is what praxis means. It means that I'm not trying to awaken your conscious to an alternate reality that you didn't realize existed. I'm just trying to struggle with you, to strategize, to resist together, because it's all through our bodies that we resist. Like, I'm not going to change your thinking. I'm not going to change the people we're struggling against. I'm not going to change how they see the world, but I'm going to fight against them. And that's what theory, you know, he's saying that writing this kind of theory is an act. It is practice. So you don't need, with Foucault and post-structuralism, you don't need a revolution, because you have these tiny acts of resistance and collective actions in some cases, but they always fall apart and they're always partial. Okay, and so Foucault, like, power would be a fragile thing if it's only functionally repressed. So it's not about discovering the truth about our repressed desires. He wrote about sexuality. The problem is, how do people become subjects to a particular kind of sexual experience, as one example? So again, this is why people can write things like the history of heterosexuality or the history of homosexuality. How do we come to an age where sexuality is understood in a certain way? Why does that episteme predominate right now? And so his work really did, it just put this, it put the LGBTQ movement in, it helped put that into overdrive, because it really did change the way people think about sexuality. And they use that to sap power, right? Not to change, okay, even if I can't change the way you see sexuality or your consciousness of it, I'm going to use it as a basis to form coalitions to change the laws and to change the activities and to change the way people see it morally. So again, sapping power is more the goal here, not just illuminating people about, hey, homosexuality should be acceptable. It's been done through history. No, sometimes that doesn't work. So it's all about power. And so you increase people's knowledge about the history of sexuality. It also, you know, by increasing people's knowledge of the history of sexuality and how diverse human history has been in terms of sexuality, you're sapping power away from those people who have been defining non-heterosexual sexual practices as deviant, as immoral, and as not worthy of investing in as a society. And so I hope that makes sense. So this video will be on YouTube. You can go back and listen to that sentence. That's Foucault in a nutshell. That's how theory can be power, right? So it can help you sap power. That's how theory can be practiced. And so I'm gonna stop there because I'm out of time. I said I was gonna go the whole time, and here I am, I went the whole time. So I'm gonna go over, you'll have your grades Wednesday, I promise. I know I keep saying that. It's hard out there for everybody, I know. So that's just my version of it. And on Wednesday, we'll just talk about the final. We'll go over some of the questions. Pick your question, you can ask it here. I'm not gonna lecture on Wednesday, but I'll dip back into whatever you need me to help answer the questions. So I'm gonna log off here. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. So look at that excerpt from Introducing Postmodernism. It really helps understand some of the more complex concepts here. And it shows your connection definitely between linguistics and social theory. So look at those and you'll have ample time to ask me about it. And then you'll have a week to work on your final. And don't worry, again, I probably shouldn't say this, but don't worry about your grade on the final. Just do it. Just put something together, do your best, and I'm going to be very forgiving about the grade. So, for the presentation, okay, now I see the text that was from a while back. So Emily had asked for the presentation, can it be on a topic we did for a past essay? Yes, you can do that. So, okay. And if you have any questions about how to do a presentation, you can ask me those on Wednesday as well. So, all right, I'll see you guys next time. But I love your background. Oh, Stanley, wait. Thanks. Yeah, I was just looking for some kind of background. Have a good day too. Yeah, you're the first person to mention it. Most people don't realize what that is. So if you watch The Office, you're gonna, that's the confessional from The Office. Like Stanley said, I feel like Stanley right now. Like, but all right, I'll see y'all later.